G'day everyone, I'm Wesley Enoch and I'm your host for CIAF Conversations. Our guest today is Cameron Costello, who's the Deputy Chair of QTIC, which is the Queensland Tourism
Industry
Council. There we go, got it right. And Cameron is also a Quantum Mooka man, as I am, so just putting up their conflicts of interest. We said we should maybe start a little podcast called Two Quanties. So we'll see how that goes down. Hey, but I'm here actually in Canberra on Ngunnawal Ngambri country and just want to pay my respects to the elders of this country. Where are you, Cameron?
I'm out at Wynnum on Quantum Mooka country, so I'm home of where our ancestors have walked for millennia.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and can I say it was 14 degrees here in Canberra and it was like 30 degrees up where you are, and I know where I'd rather be.
Yeah.
Hey, Cameron, what we're talking about here is we're going to talk about cultural tourism, in First Nations tourism. Tell us a little bit about how do you define what is, in fact, First Nations tourism?
Yeah, and it was an interesting comment. We had our Destination IQ, our peak Indigenous Tourism Forum last week, and people were saying any tourism is Indigenous tourism because you can't escape the fact that any visitation you take in Australia is on First Nations people's lands. So cultural tourism, it's broad, it's quite broad, but it's basically about First Nations experiences, tourism experiences that you have. And that can be quite broad as well, from just purchasing a gift, which is First Nations experience, or actually having a tour or staying at a place owned by a First Nations person. So it's quite broad.
And sometimes we think of cultural tourism then as being, yes, visiting country, going on country that is maybe not built up. But is there also kind of urban experiences in cities and towns that are Indigenous tourism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it goes back to the reflection of the sense of place, and people, when they travel, want that to experience that part of the planet that they're on. And so naturally our rich and diverse cultures, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, permeate everywhere across this fine country. And so definitely in urban context, you've got, particularly if you look at Brisbane, for example, there's a lot of First Nations galleries and restaurants and tours happening where and it might be a First Nations person taking you on a tour around to non-Aboriginal, galleries, etc. as well. So definitely takes place across the rich diversity. And what we're seeing is, my experience going around the state is that rich and diverse cultural experience, from desert outback to the rainforest to the Torres Strait, the Cape, Gold Coast beaches, sand islands. It's all there, eh?
And of course, we're talking about tourism now in this time of CIAF, and I see you got your hat on, you got your product placement there, the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair. I mean, the selling of art, the engagement with artists and communities making art, that seems to be a big thing. That our art is one of the most tangible things of our culture that people take away. Can you just talk us through what are some of the most popular cultural tourism kind of products that we see around the place?
Yeah, I think we're seeing an evolution of what society sees as a First Nations experience. Obviously, art and dance and performance have been what have been there for so long. And we've got to also take into the historical context of the exclusion of the sector as well. Like in every sector that you've had in economic development, we've been excluded to the fringes of that. And so art, but visual art has been that one stronghold where we've been able to be in there. And of course, performance. And we're seeing that evolve from being just pure performance to actually First Nations people now actually owning campgrounds and owning tour buses and stuff like that. So, and that evolution of what is the First Nations experience, or how First Nations people are engaged in the tourism sector, is really changing as society changes. And, we're on the path to treaty, and native title is giving land back, and managing national parks, which are the largest tourism assets, we've got in the state is national parks. And so our rangers are on country doing that stuff too. So it's really broad now, and it's evolving to be that reflection of actually even changing the names of national parks, etc., of places to reflect their identity to action, which again provides that story and context of where we are.
Well, and maybe this is a much broader question too about what role does tourism play for our communities, like not just economic by the sounds of it, but very, very strongly economic.
Yeah, and I think you can see like also so through our art, through our festivals as well, like the role that the festivals, and we've got some beautiful, rich festivals right across the state, from the Winds of Zenith to Laura to CIAF to Quandamooka Festival, that's, up in Bundy, they're doing stuff. And so they have such a broad role beyond just tourism. It's about social, cultural, spiritual, environmental outcomes for community. And that's the importance of tourism is it's a great path for reconciliation. Quite often it provides a safe place for reconciliation and empowerment of our people. So if you look at, say, Fiona Foley's public artworks that she had, they're actually, I said last week at Destination IQ that, because she did a keynote presentation, is that her pieces are iconic tourism truth-telling icons, like they really are. And we need more of those throughout the state because they're fantastic.
And you were talking earlier about, we're moving into conversations about treaties and sovereignty to conversations. What role does tourism play in those conversations, do you think?
Yeah, well, it's amazing because I think it was 2012 when on Larrakia country, there was a World Tourism Conference, and they developed the Larrakia Principles. And they're basically they're based on the United Nations rights of the Indigenous people. And so those Larrakia Principles have been almost this human rights foundation for tourism. And I think it was 2019, the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, and that's the peak body for the industry in Queensland, adopted those Larrakia Principles. And so we're promoting those foundational principles, which are human rights, to underpin tourism, and that's about empowerment. And the Queensland government, on their path to treaty, they've passed a human rights bill which has specific reference to First Nations arts and culture as well. We're seeing tourism, the arts sectors really under that, at the foundation is about human rights and our right to express ourselves. And from that, you create and develop these economies, and tourism is one of those ones that can benefit our mob.
And it sounds too that it's important that we're in charge of those things as well. Like you were saying then about people owning galleries, community members owning galleries or tour buses and things. Have you seen this shift in the last, let's say, 10 years to, not just us being the performers or the makers of the work, but now we're actually owning the companies? Yeah,
absolutely. And I'll point to my Quandamooka 10 years of native title anniversary shirt, which is a great case study where we've been able to unlock, we've had the return of ownership over our lands, and that has enabled us to unlock, and that we've gone from, on the, I guess, the lighter side of actually just being an artist or a performer, which is powerful in itself, but to actually say now we are owning the land and we'll say what happens on our land, and we'll determine how tourism happens, which controls and regulates. It's like a regulation power. That's something that I've seen the change in that, as well as those, so empowering First Nations people through their rights being recognised, but also the sector is starting to undergo a transformation where the boards and governance of decision making, which impacts First Nations people's lands and tourism, is changing as well. So I'm the deputy, for example, I'm the deputy chair of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, first Aboriginal person appointed to that council. You've got Nancy Bamberger and Dwayne Fraser, who are on the board of Tourism and Events Queensland, and then you've got these other First Nations arts and so you've got all this sort of governance and decision making and you've been on a number of boards yourself now. So that has enabled us to not only have decisions with our own assets and resources, but also to impact how industry thinks and behaves in an appropriate way that facilitates and creates a positive environment to empower and hear the voices of First Nations people.
Well, we've just come through this. We're in the middle of it now to the federal inquiry into, the fake art and things like that as well. I mean, those kind of things where we're not in charge. What does that mean for us if then people are ripping us off or they're making the money off our labour or our images and things? Yeah,
I mean, that's number one, the impact it has on us personally as First Nations people. And you look at people like Michael Connolly, who has been fighting this, around fake art. There's that aspect to it and the unjust nature of those sorts of things happening. But it also is negatively impacting the tourism sector itself, because only when you have that protections and safeguards around authentic art it enhances the value of your tourism product. So from a social justice and also from a business and economics perspective, it makes pure sense to try and protect and conserve and that authenticity and the empowerment of First Nations people as well.
Well, then how important is something like CIAF then, which is, it's a market, it's sure, it's been a bit COVID affected again this year, but it's an incredible platform from which a lot of conversations happen. How does that affect, art centres and how they're working to build their tourism market as well?
Look, CIAF is, and I was involved with the early days of the creation, and I'll acknowledge Arone's work behind me, Arone Meeks, who has sadly passed, who was one of those pioneers before CIAF came about raising all these issues we're talking about. And CIAF and backing Indigenous arts were seen as these programs that were actually advancing and helping us to develop the avenues and the pathways. So we had these great programs that would help develop the product and stuff. And then CIAF was there to really showcase to the world the great outcomes of what you can achieve through that authentic product development. And so CIAF is critical in promoting our First Nations Indigenous art centres and what they're doing, and they're doing it appropriately, and feeding and, I guess, building momentum and a critical mass of authentic Indigenous experiences that have, at the basis and core of it was about those empowerment of First Nations people and the benefits of their communities driving income, so the social and cultural benefits as well. But it has become, it's Australia's premier Indigenous art fair. It's renowned. It's in its 12th year or something, and fantastic. But it becomes an industry platform that actually itself becomes an advocate for these issues. So CIAF becomes the voice of all the art centres coming together, and the galleries and industry and government, all the good players come together and have that platform. And so it becomes a force in itself. And that's why it's such an important event, is that it's bigger than any one art centre or one artist. It's like we've created this amazing phenomenon that is going to drive forward. And I think I spoke to you about when we can all come together, when COVID allows. The last couple of years was actually imagining if we get all of our festivals together and they collectively have a voice that says this, we want this sort of strategy moving forward. This is the voice of the collective art fairs and festivals. I mean, that would be taking it to another level as well.
It sounds too that you could almost make a calendar then of all the events throughout the year that people could then dip in and out of. And we'll come back to kind of a peak body a bit later, because I know that there's a new peak body that's been established. And we talked a little bit about how CIAF was affected by COVID this last little while. Give us a sense, in Queensland in particular, who are the audiences? Who are the people who are engaging in cultural tourism, First Nations tourism at the moment? Are they overseas? Are they locals? What's the mix? Can you tell us anything like that?
Yeah, there is a mix. There's definitely internationals, but domestic from interstate. There's a lot of interstate domestic people that come to Queensland that are interested as well. But I actually think, and COVID's obviously affected that in some ways, but it has actually also opened people's eyes a lot within the Australian market to First Nations tourism. And there's been a lot of reflection, and the demand for First Nations tourism is just growing so rapidly because everyone's reflecting on the environment and climate change and First Nations knowledge in fire management and how we have been custodians. People want to know now how that works, and they just seem to have looked at this interest in terms of First Nations people and young people as well. Kids are learning it at school and coming home and wanting to find out. And so there's also this, I think the growth of First Nations product as well. We're just slowly starting to see more and more First Nations tourism operators, which is, again, providing the supply and being able to connect in. But the demand is growing, and once the international borders open and open up domestically, there's a massive influx of people wanting to come to Queensland and get that experience.
Because I've had a few flights recently, I've just noticed that Qantas is now acknowledging country as it lands. It lands and the flight attendant acknowledges country and pays respects. And you go, when did that happen? That just kind of happened. And I've also read that in Perth, that Perth Airport is now going to have dual naming of different places that flights will be going to. I mean, there's a big shift happening, and I put it down to cultural tourism has really embedded these things that people, the general public as well as international visitors, have been going, actually, this is not unusual anymore. It's something that I want. And that the respect is just growing and growing. Maybe I'm being a bit too utopic, but you feel that it's growing all the time.
And I think that just those small wins of things that happen and go, people go, wow, that's really cool. And then people go, yeah, we could do that too on our show or this or that. So whether it's on the news, but we had a panel called Planes, Trains and Watermobiles at our Indigenous conference. And that was to highlight just some of the things that are happening. So we had the Transport Minister there, Mark Bailey, because I've noticed just from the transport, and this isn't, this is what the Transport Department's done. So with the trains, so they've got Lacey Carmichael, when you go to tap on, everything is wrapped in Lacey Carmichael's artwork. And then the trains are wrapped in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander wraps. And then you get on the train and there's these digital information things, and they actually show images flashing up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander work gangs building the railways.
Yeah.
So some truth telling. And then from Gladstone, I think it was Bundaberg up to Gladstone this year, they launched, as you come into those stations, GPSs are welcome to country from that particular group. And I went, that's not even a tourism department. That's the Transport Department doing their reconciliation action plan, but it feeds into that tourism experience. So and then like you're saying, at airports and stuff too, and then on water as well. So there's all these opportunities that are just happening through reconciliation action plans, etc., that they're doing stuff. And the good thing for the arts sector is that most raps talk about we need more artwork and we need interpretive signage, and that creates this momentum and building this throughout Queensland. So for me, there's some really amazing things happening, and business is leading the way ahead of government too. Government seems to sit back a bit and wait, whereas businesses and corporates are really embracing it. And there's some amazing examples and case studies of corporates and tourism ventures leading the way in collaboration and empowering First Nations voices. So the Stockman's Hall of Fame at Longreach has done some amazing stuff with Susan Thompson and a few people out there. If you go, and so the Qantas Museum out there as well is really embraced and showcasing how First Nations people have been involved. So for me, there's looking at some of those and build momentum, and everyone goes, oh yeah, we should do that. So I'm hoping things like the Echo and, which we should have our Stockman and women's stories at the Echo. And where's our First Nations pavilion at our Echo with our authentic tourism, show bags.
Well, this is an interesting thing. So what are the kind of big opportunities as you see them for in First Nations tourism throughout Queensland? What are the big opportunities that you think, if someone's watching now going, oh, actually, here are the 5 things you should really think about, or 3 things, or whatever the right number is, that should really be pushing us ahead?
Yep, I think the announcement of the Olympic Games and the Paralympics, that is the one that is going to really be the critical milestone for us moving forward. So at the moment, it's a matter of how do we coordinate and mobilise as our own mobs to come together and be prepared for that, because, if you saw the pitch, which was a fabulous pitch, it did, some people say, roll us out again, like a lot of First Nations content. So we had, again, at our conference on Wednesday, Kerry Peterson, who's in charge of Task Force 2032 for the Olympics within the Premier's Department, we ran a plenary session around the Olympic Games, and it is unbelievable what is coming our way. And that's not just for Brisbane, it's for all Southeast Queensland and Australia. So the possibilities there are amazing. I think that's one that we just can't not, and I think the path to treaty is the other one as well. So I believe in terms of, like I was saying before, the truth-telling journey, performance, the arts, tourism, they're great ways for us to take the rest of Australia on that journey. I think there's opportunities for massive truth-telling public art trails sites throughout Queensland, and having our mob telling those stories as well. And I just think those are the sorts of key things that are possibly going to be of such magnitude going forward. Obviously, I think, if we can get some of that other political change through, that's going to have flow-on effects as well. But any major infrastructure program, from stadiums through to games, and we've got the World Cup of Soccer coming. There's all sports linking to tourism and us linking to the environment and conservation. So I think the expansion of in the environment, the expansion of protected area states, and the recognition on the of First Nations people's knowledge in protecting the environment links so closely to tourism as well. So joint, management of national parks and marine parks are so linked to tourism, because people will want to visit those as well. So I do think that conservation and the environment are critical too.
I mean, I straight away go, oh, that feels like every blackfella should have a job. Like, it feels like it's going to be, everyone's trained up, everyone will get opportunities, it'll be kind of a big thing. But surely there are obstacles. I wonder whether we're about to hit peak blackfella. There's not enough of us for the opportunities and demand that's coming up. What do we need to do to overcome some of the obstacles? What are some of the obstacles to achieving the vision and getting the most out of it?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, how we coordinate. So how we mobilise and create a coordinated voice. And, if I think of the tourism sector, but also other industry sectors as well, whether it's food or agriculture. We used to have ATSIC and all those representative bodies, but we don't have them anymore. And so within tourism, for example, QTIC's gone, well, we've got Indigenous employees and stuff, but we're not the voice. We can't. So we're looking at creating that voice for First Nations people. And I think that's one of the critical obstacles to us achieving our potential, is not being coordinated within ourselves. I do think that some of the other challenges are around, like you were saying, just the numbers of people. So we need to build capacity of our organisations, and develop our skills and training through those particular sectors, because, and it's like most economic development sectors, we've been excluded from them. So now, how do we get pathways for our young people coming out of school? Because we're talking about a 10-year horizon for the Olympic Games. So that's looking at my children who are 12 and 14 to be in those spaces. So we have to look at how we create and employ our young people and create and leadership's the other thing too. I think is really critical is how we, get our next leaders and support the next lot of leaders coming through and keep developing them as well. And of course, the resourcing. We're just an under-resourced sector, and in terms of First Nations arts, tourism, and the environment, and the money that's put in there quite often doesn't flow to the right places. So that's a big challenge, is how effectively and efficiently resources can be done. And I guess if we're talking about that the regulation to support First Nations people needs to change as well. So, whether it is around fake art or it's about protection of cultural heritage, these are really critical things in terms of the regulation space for First Nations people. It can all be sorted if we get the Uluru Statement to the heart, mate, and we get treaty done. But I think the promising thing, I think the Queensland government setting up the Treaty Institute and the Path to Treaty, which is going to have a massive input, massive change for us. Obviously, there'll be things to work out, but I think it's about just building on the momentum. And sometimes we're our own worst enemies too, brother. We've got to make sure that we stay as united as possible and move forward together.
I think, the next CIAF conversation I'm doing is actually about treaty and the road and the path to treaty, which is interesting that all these things like art, culture, tourism, economic development, treaty, they all become the same thing as that we put ourselves in the center of it. Maybe this is a good time to talk about this peak body that was set up, is in the process of being set up last week. I mean, why do we need a peak body? You were saying so we can coordinate and put things together. But just talk about what this peak body would be and how is it being set up?
Yeah, so what I'll do is hold up. This was the First Nations, Queensland First Nations Tourism Plan 2020 to 2025. And so what happened, I mentioned before, like Queensland Tourism Industry Council was sort of being the de facto advocacy, and they had Indigenous people employed, and they had Indigenous Champions Network they've had it for over 10 years. But as it was mostly focused on employment and training, and what has become evident when I got on to the board, the first thing I noticed was there was no actual statewide strategy for First Nations tourism in Queensland. Not a government, no one. So we got that. What happened was QTIC funded us to go around the state to develop that plan. And part of the plan was a series of recommendations. And one of those recommendations coming back from community industry was about strategic coordination and structure to create an entity that gives voice to the First Nations tourism sector and provides advocacy and support. So just like the Queensland Tourism Industry Council is the voice of tourism and it advocates to government. So you would have seen the CEO, Daniel Gashwin, travelling with the Premier around COVID and stuff like that. There was the clear view, and based on the Larrakia principles, that First Nations peoples need to have their own voice in tourism as well. And so that plan was launched by the then Minister Kate Jones at Destination IQ in 2019, and there was a commitment to help support the establishment of a peak body for First Nations tourism in Queensland. So I've been going around since the start of this year around the state doing face-to-face regional consultations, and just on the second round there, developing discussion papers, etc., about what should the peak body look like, how should it be, what should the board, what should be its priorities. And so we're at that point now where we've been around, and it's definitely got the support to do that and have regions represented for their own, governance as well. So that's what we're looking to start next year. So we've had an all Indigenous working group comprised of people, and Uncle Daryl Harris from CIAF was on that, representing not only North Queensland but festivals and stuff. And now we're going, we want to have a peak body that's going to have 6 regions. Each region will elect, it's for First Nations tourism operators as members. They will vote their board member on, a voluntary board, and then that'll be about advocating for First Nations tourism across a whole range of things. So we've talked about intellectual property, the Olympics, and so having that day-to-day voice there always working with industry and government and assisting regions as well is going to be critical. And Western Australia's had one called WATOP for a number of years now, and they're eagerly anticipating this body being formed so that it can work together to look at a national body. There's no national Indigenous tourism body either to advocate at a national level. What's been really great is going around having those conversations in regions is that they then start formalising and mobilising themselves as a region. So our trip to the Torres Strait brought together the Torres Strait Regional Authority and tour operators and the Torres Strait Council, and basically the discussion was they needed to have a forum in March to establish their plan for there's no local tourism organisation, there's no Torres Strait tourism. And their regional tourism organisation is Tropical Tourism North Queensland, based in Cairns.
Yeah.
So it's creating this sort of statewide momentum that will feed into a state level voice that can advocate both at a state level and at a national level for First Nations people as we go into these critical times.
So, I mean, how was it done before? It's just ad hoc?
Ad hoc, yeah.
Just moving around in that way.
Yeah, and that's why we wondered why First Nations tourism hasn't, reached its potential, and why it's because without a strategy and someone to advocate and implement that strategy, that'll be there. So, I mean, it'll be an establishment phase, but it'll have partners that will deliver key things around marketing, because there's a lot of Indigenous advisory groups and lots of industry groups that are there that it will partner to deliver those key things around training and employment. So we talked about how do we get enough people that advocacy body will work with people, with TAFE and with other training providers to go, let's get that strategy to help build our workforce for arts and culture and tourism.
So in terms of if I was an artist who worked in a solo practice, making earrings, say, of things, would I be able to then approach this council and get some support in some way?
Yeah. So with this First Nations tourism plan, the elements of it, and one of those is about product development, support and training. That so the peak body, from the consultations, its role will be to not necessarily be the deliverer, but to partner with mentors of small businesses and small business and training, IBA, so that when someone comes, we can go, there's a 4-year program and you can tap into that program, and here's the key contacts, and let us know how you go. So we will keep in contact with you to make sure you're in there. And so that's part of the role, is not to necessarily be the be all and end all and deliver everything, but actually help direct artists and arts organisations into the right support mechanisms. And it's really clear that consultations took in, mentoring is really a big key thing. Okay. Small business support, so people just starting out, and then people who have been out in there, that small to medium business that's been in the game for a while that wants to go to the next level. So it really is looking at that plan. And I think a bit like the back Indigenous arts programs, there needs to be and this year was the year of Indigenous tourism. So what we're saying at the conference was the year of Indigenous tourism is coming to an end, but we actually need multi-year investment going forward to the Olympics in those things around small business support, artist support, which can come from a range of sources, whether it's Arts Queensland, tourism. That's what needs to happen from here, because going into the Olympics, we've got 10 years. There should be 10 years planned strategic investment to make sure that we've created this wonderful environment for our artists and tourism operators to flourish.
Well, it sounds like also the Olympics might be a goal, but in fact, the goal is actually the legacy that can be put in place as well. All these structures, all these businesses, companies perhaps as well.
Yeah.
All together.
Yeah.
I'm just going to take us a little bit to COVID now and just go, where hopefully borders opening and there's a lot more mobility and things like that. In terms of recovery from COVID, I've seen a lot of online sales platforms as well for artists. I've seen a lot of digital performance work and things like that. Do you think we'll keep some of those things as we go forward in the tourism area, or is coming to country actually the key?
it's going to be interesting. I think it will be a combination. But the other thing too is just the innovation. What's happening with innovation and digital and AR and VR, virtual reality. There's all these different types. I think there will always be a market, and there is a growing momentum towards on-country experiences. But there's different markets for, like the Paralympics. So how do we cater for people with disabilities to have a First Nations tourism experience as well? But those are the sorts of things that are growing. So I think we're going to see, it'll be this core of people want to hear those stories, and there's nothing more authentic than being on country, hearing stories. So I think that's going to be always a central thing, but there will be a broader range of options and activities for people as well, and that's going to always occur, I think.
And we've seen some situations. Before we started the broadcast, we were talking about Jabberkai, where it had this terrible situation of it closing, but now there's a sense of it being reborn in a different way. I mean, is COVID a chance to kind of, strip away, get back to what we really think is important and build from that?
Yeah, tourism sectors are evolving and changing from COVID, and I think it has been a lot of organisations and operators are looking at how they are entering this new phase in the new world for tourism. So what international visitors will want to look at and expect, and what our domestic tourism, there seems to be this growth in wanting to have that truly authentic experience on country and hear the story about the land and the history. People are very interested in that. What is the history of the land? I think there will always be place for what I call our iconic tourism attractions, like Spirits of the Red Sand, Jabberkai, Dreamtime Cultural Centre, Gadigal Cultural Centre. But they may have to adapt as well. And I think Spirits of the Red Sand is a good one, where it's a really strong truth-telling side to it, as opposed to we used to be just people rocking up for a performance in one way, where it is actually now part of this evolution of what people want and what we want too. Like, we want to be able to tell our stories how they should be told, not for what people want. And I think there was a great panel session about actually how First Nations people are disruptors in a way to how tourism operates. So mass tourism, people coming on country doing whatever they want, is no longer, as we get control and empowered over our cultural assets, that's not how the game is played anymore. It's about you're a guest on country, and we're changing because of our priorities are protection of cultural heritage, of the environment, of the flora and fauna, and you're a guest coming into that space. And that's a real big shift, particularly when there's competing interests of people who, businesses that want four-wheel drives, more four-wheel drives on the island. That's a competing interest. And so there is a bit of tension around First Nations people copping a bit of a pasting because we're wanting to close down areas because people are they're disrespecting. There's not enough regulation and control over that. So we're going through this tension within the tourism sector as well, which I think there's some education around that too.
Well, I think this is also a question around will look, let's say the bulk of people will, but will people actually honour the sovereignty that we have over our own country? And this notion of tourism is not it's not a right, it's actually a privilege to kind of undertake some of these activities and participate, or to purchase a piece of art and to understand it all as well. I mean, just as we kind of come to a close here, Cameron, just what are the kind of pieces of advice you have for someone who's setting up a cultural tourism business today? What's the piece of advice or a couple of pieces of advice that you think, when you're thinking about the next 10 years, what do you need to do to make sure it's authentic, right for you, and has some kind of longevity?
Yeah, I think ticking off with your local cultural protocols within your own mob. I think that's first and foremost, so that you can get that tick to advance in terms of how you want to progress forward. Then I think you should look at getting your industry and government support. So your regional tourism organisations for up around Cairns would be, Tropical Tourism North Queensland, the local council. So they're really keen to support and engage with local businesses as well. And the space is so big, you don't have to compete directly. You can create your own unique product that complements what's already happening in that space. And then I think you need to clearly develop what your strategy and your plan is. You need to have a plan, a 3-year plan, because it'll be tough, and that's when most businesses fail in their first 3 years. Yeah. And get that business support. Don't go in it with your eyes. You need to go in fully aware that it's a challenge. It's hard, but it's so rewarding as well, and it can provide all those other benefits for you as a First Nations person working on country, and that it's truly rewarding, the tourism space, the arts and tourism space, but it's also challenging. And just plan and get those right connections, and don't be afraid to ask for support from industry and government, because there's a lot of good people out there.
And keep your eye out for this peak body that you've just established as well.
Yeah.
Just fantastic. And I just know that you're doing your bit too. David Hudson got you up dancing on stage, doing shake a leg or fumble foot, you said.
Yeah.
It was more fumble foot than shake a leg.
I was more akin to fumble foot too, yeah. And to make it worse, he got me up there with Dwayne Fraser, who I think Shawnee Chilborough affectionately called him the Black Ken doll. So it was like Macca Packer meets Black Ken doll, dancing with Black Ken doll. But yeah, it was a real honour. I mean, David Hudson's an elder of our tourism sector, and you can't refuse him getting up on stage, even though it was in front of over 1,000 people.
Well, look, you're behind everyone getting up there and performing, being part of the audience, really promoting cultural tourism, First Nations tourism. And I take my hat off to you because, well, I don't have to. You've got your own hat on. But that whole idea of going CIAF and the work that you did at CIAF early on, and now to see that legacy growing, there's so much more in the cultural tourism area that we really can get in there. Just for those who are watching, this is CIAF Conversation. We've been talking to Cameron Costello, who's the Deputy Chair of QTIC, the Queensland Tourism Industry Council, and now it sounds like he's going to be advocating for this new Indigenous Tourism Council as well to be established and get up and rolling, so to get out there and give some more advice. And we've been talking about cultural tourism as a sense too, I think, I've got a real sense of sovereignty, I've got a sense of self-determination, and the idea that it's not just about economic development, it's also about cultural continuity and keeping your family and your country alive by making sure your culture is being appreciated and honoured by everyone around it. So I think it's been great to have this chat, Cameron. And if you do want to come back, you can check out the CIAF Conversations. There's one about Othello, a new production by Queensland Theatre that's been part of CIAF this year. And also there's one coming up talking about treaty and the notion of our path to treaty, which is pretty much what we've been talking about here. Even though it's been through a tourism lens, it's really kind of been talking about how we take charge of our own future and our own storytelling, which has been deadly. Hey, thanks, Cameron. You're really deadly, mate.
Thank you. And I can only imagine what CIAF's going to be like in 2032. It'll be unbelievable.
Well, let's be there for that vision. Let's stay alive for it. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.